Let's jump right in. If I were to tell you that the Mahabharat might actually be real, what's the first thing that pops into your head? You're probably thinking about the underwater excavations at Dwarka, right? Or maybe the archaeological digs happening around Kurukshetra. But what if I told you the absolute strongest proof isn't buried in the dirt at all? It's actually hidden right there in the text itself. We're talking about clues so deeply embedded in the poetry and the narrative, almost nobody notices them on a casual read. Today, in this explainer, we're going completely beyond the physical ruins to look at the narrative DNA of this massive, sprawling epic. Let's see what we can find. So this brings us to the core premise of our investigation today. Is the Mahabharat pure myth, or is it grounded in hard, undeniable reality? We're basically putting on our detective hats right now to analyze this ancient story from an entirely new perspective. We aren't just looking at this as a revered, sacred text. Instead, we're treating it as a potential historical document, a record of real human events that has been passed down, expanded, and preserved through millennia. Now, usually when people search for the truth of the ancient world, they look for physical stuff. Ancient swords, carbon-dated chariots, sunken cities. And hey, that approach is perfectly fine, but it's kind of incomplete. Today, we're going to analyze the narrative clues buried deep within the verses of the epic, because honestly, sometimes human psychology, intricate political strategy, and sheer geographical accuracy tell us way more about a civilization's reality than a broken piece of pottery ever could. We're looking for the echoes of real human behavior here. Section 1. Flawed heroes, bitter victories. Okay, let's dive into this. If this story was purely a fabricated legend meant to inspire people, the heroes would be absolutely perfect, right? But in the Mahabharat, they are incredibly, sometimes frustratingly flawed. Take Yudhishthir. He's supposed to be the ultimate emblem of pure righteousness. Yet, the guy has a devastating gambling addiction that literally ruins his family and loses their kingdom. Then you've got Arjun, the absolute greatest, most celebrated warrior of his time, suffering a complete psychological breakdown right on the battlefield just as the war is about to begin. And Bhishma, this wise, incredibly powerful patriarch, ends up standing on the wrong side of a brutal war, actively fighting against the people he knows are right. This brings us to a massive narrative clue. Fairy tale heroes just don't make these kinds of catastrophic moral mistakes. Real historical figures, though, they are completely, deeply flawed. Think about the stark contrast between how fairy tales operate and how real history actually unfolds. In a fairy tale, you get flawless protagonists, a clear-cut villain, and a neatly wrapped happy ending where everyone celebrates. But another massive clue pointing to reality is the nature of the Mahabharat's ending itself. The Pandavas won the war, sure, but they lost almost everyone they ever loved in the process. It was a Pyrrhic victory of the absolute highest order. Their children were slaughtered in their sleep, their lineages were nearly wiped out, and their victory felt like ash in their mouths. If this epic was just kingly propaganda written by court poets to flatter a wealthy royal dynasty, the ending would be a pure, joyful celebration of their divine right to rule. Instead, it ends in complete, hollow destruction. That is the bitter, unmistakable taste of real history. Which brings us to a really powerful realization. History is uncomfortable, marketing is not. Just ask yourself this. If you were going to sit down and write a completely fake, glorified story about your own ancestors to make your family look like literal gods descended from the heavens, would you portray them as compulsive gamblers? Would you show them heavily biased or having moments of sheer cowardice? Of course you wouldn't. The Mahabharata openly and brutally displays the dark, uncomfortable side of its own celebrated heroes. You don't write that if you're just marketing your lineage to the masses. You write that when you are bound by the uncomfortable memory of a historical truth that everyone in society already knows. Moving on to Section 2, Real Politics and Geography. When we think of Lord Krishna, we often picture grand, divine miracles. But if you read the text closely and strip away the later additions, another totally compelling piece of evidence emerges. Krishna's most powerful weapon during the entirety of the Kurukshetra war wasn't magic at all. It was his brain. He rarely solves the massive overarching problems of the war with sudden, inexplicable miracles that just magically fix everything. Instead, he relies heavily on intense diplomacy, deep psychological warfare, and brilliant cutthroat tactical strategy. This portrayal doesn't read like a magical myth created to wow children. It reads like a shockingly realistic account of a genius statesman navigating a highly complex, devastating political crisis.
Because the Mahabharat is not just some simple story of good versus evil in a vacuum. It's a sprawling geopolitical saga. It involves hundreds of regional kings, incredibly complex marriage pacts designed purely for political leverage, messy successions over the throne, fragile military alliances, and constantly shifting power dynamics. Characters like Duryodhan, Shakuni, Vidur, and Krishna don't act like cartoon villains or pure saints. They think exactly like modern-day politicians. They make carefully calculated decisions based on public perception, troop numbers, and hard negotiations behind closed doors. This level of granular, intensely detailed state politics usually doesn't spring from pure imagination. It almost always stems from real institutional memory of how the ancient world actually operated.
And it's not just the political landscape that feels incredibly grounded, it's the physical map itself. We are given astonishing geographic detail throughout the chapters. The text meticulously outlines distinct kingdoms, varying regional cultures, established economic trade routes, and specific identifiable river systems. When you actually map it all out, this doesn't feel like a vague fantasy realm drawn up for a fairy tale with generic places like the Dark Mountains. It feels like a shockingly accurate, lived-in, highly populated civilization that actually existed, traded with one another, and ultimately went to war over real, physical land. All right, Section 3, Practical War and Contradictions. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point. When modern audiences think of the Kurukshetra War, they almost immediately think of the Brahmastras, these massive, magical, almost nuclear-like weapons raining down fire from the sky. But look at the actual data within the text. That magical element, the divine weapons and celestial interventions, takes up maybe a tiny 5% of the narrative. A massive 95% of the war is entirely, brutally practical. It is grinding, exhausting, terrifying combat using swords, heavy chariots, composite bows, war elephants, and complex hand-to-hand infantry formations. So despite remembering the legendary weapons, the core battlefield mechanics described in the text were shockingly practical, grounded, and rooted in the bloody reality of ancient warfare. Now, consider the history of the text itself. Across different regions of India, there are multiple versions and recensions of the Mahabharat that have survived for thousands of years. And here's the kicker. Their details don't perfectly match. There are noticeable inconsistencies, overlapping timelines, and structural contradictions depending on which regional manuscript you read. Now, if this were a totally fake story, completely manufactured by one specific group at one specific time, they would have carefully polished out all those contradictions to make it a perfect, seamless narrative. But old, real oral traditions that are passed down over centuries across massive geographies, they actually preserve these mistakes. The fact that the story doesn't perfectly hide its own seams is a huge indicator of an organic, historical root. Let's head into our final part, Section 4, When History Becomes Sacred. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. Because how exactly does a real, gritty, historical event morph into a pristine, religious epic? This reveals perhaps the most fascinating possibility of all. In year zero, a massive, devastating civil war actually occurs. It completely traumatizes the subcontinent, wiping out an entire generation of young men. Decades later, as the survivors and their children recount the horror, the incredible heroism, and the profound loss, they begin to naturally add layers of philosophy, moral lessons, and deep symbolism to try and make sense of the overwhelming tragedy. Then, centuries later, the original history, the grand epic storytelling traditions, and the deep theological concepts of Dharma completely merge together. What you're left with isn't just a history book anymore. It's been elevated into a sacred text. So what does this all mean? Are we looking at pure history, pure mythology, or a complex, fascinating combination of both? Now, to be absolutely clear, we aren't saying that this analysis proves every single magical detail of the Mahabharat actually happened exactly as written. But when you deeply analyze the flawed human psychology, the bitter geopolitical realities, the intricate statecraft, and the intensely practical nature of the world building, the more you read it, the less fictional it seems. It genuinely feels like the echoes of a very real past. What do you think? I want you to weigh the narrative clues we cover today and share your thoughts in the comments. Is this purely a myth, or is there a real ancient war buried deep beneath the poetry? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.